Finally, when one puts themselves to the challenging task of trying to answer these questions, why did the war end as it did? Why aren't we all living in a Nazi-dominated world today? It does well to carefully consider the personality and psychology of the man responsible for it all. Adolf Hitler's image as a murderous, bloodthirsty tyrant, which causes fear in the minds of many to this day, greatly distracts from the fact that this man was both a very flawed leader and a very flawed military commander. These truths would be exposed throughout the Second World War. Despite having served in the First World War in his youth, Hitler came to power with relatively little understanding of how to plan and carry out a nation's military objectives. He often proved unable to identify and concentrate on his greatest priorities in each battle, and would repeatedly fail to put the collective advice of his generals and other compatriots into effective action. Perhaps it was inevitable, given Hitler's meteoric rise to power and his position as Germany's savior, but he became marred with such qualities as heedlessness, egocentrism, and over-the-top ambition, all of which would ultimately prove fatal for him over the course of the war. To cite a key example, the Fuhrer never managed to successfully coordinate his desire for power and territory with that of his Italian counterpart, Benito Mussolini. Hence, while Italy could very well have become a powerful and contributing partner to the Nazi war effort, this fascist nation instead became a drain to Germany's resources and often offset their progress, most critically during their preparation for the invasion of Russia. And Hitler's inability to act decisively upon his general's instructions, and the subsequent inability to form effective battle plans, would repeatedly cost him in several crucial theaters of the conflict. When the Nazis attempted to conquer Britain in 1940, certain that they would be capable of victory, Hitler had never really mapped out how he would proceed with an operation of this nature. His army was not familiar with this amphibious style of war, and Hitler repeatedly rejected several of his top generals' plans for attack. Such was the kind of recklessness, ill-preparedness, and lack of cohesive strategy that would prove so damaging to the Nazi war effort over time. In this case, their inability to make definitive war choices only gave the British more time to develop their secret radar system, which proved extremely helpful for them in countering the German Luftwaffe during the air raid. In a comparable scenario, Hitler felt fully confident in launching Operation Barbarossa, citing his nation's need for Lebensraum, and yet failed to decide where and how to concentrate this immense attack. Several leading generals insisted they should target Moscow. Hitler was firm on going for the Ukraine. No one could decide for good, so finally the Wehrmacht was split up, with one group going to Leningrad and the other to Kiev.
The question is, during Operation Barbarossa, why did Hitler divide his armies and send one half to capture the Volga and the other half to try to capture the oil fields in Baku? If he had managed to capture the oil fields in Baku, and if he had managed to hold on to the oil fields in Romania, the German economy, the German war economy, the German war machine could probably have sustained itself, but he didn't do that.
Put this indecisiveness together with the fierce Russian winter, and the Germans would ultimately suffer defeat at the hands of Stalin's Red Army, which, had they displayed the proper effort and strategy, they might very well have been able to overpower. We see this pattern repeat itself once again in the worst possible moment for the Germans, D-Day, June 6, 1944, the pivotal moment of the entire six-year conflict. Field Marshal Rommel insisted that the Allied invasion would best be stopped on the beaches themselves. Gerd von Rundstedt, by contrast, felt positive that the army should commit its resources to an inland counteroffensive. Hitler, lacking the knowledge and experience to judge which position was better to take, instead aimed for a compromise, to spread out German forces both on the beach and deeper into the mainland. As historian Stephen E. Ambrose wrote, "In trying to defend everywhere, the Germans were incapable of defending anywhere. By the end of the day, 175,000 American, Canadian, and British troops had entered Normandy. A lack of a focused strategy on Hitler's part meant that an Allied victory in this conflict would only be a matter of time." The following spring, Berlin was completely surrounded by the Allied forces, and the Red Army was soon within blocks of taking the German chancellery. Hitler could sense that his hated rivals were closing in on him, and rather than being captured, strung up, and beaten, as had just occurred to Benito Mussolini, Hitler took his own life in his Fuhrer bunker on April 30th, 1945. Now that the Fuhrer had perished, the Reich he had envisioned and personally formed would take the same course as him in less than a week. Europe's long nightmare had finally ended.
Certainly, Hitler made tremendous strategic blunders. He didn't listen to military advice. He didn't listen to foreign intelligence. He surrounded himself with sycophants. He dismissed general after general after general, and he knew absolutely nothing about military strategy. And certainly that led to tremendous difficulties in Stalingrad, in Kursk, in a whole host of battles. But to attribute the outcome of the entire war to the personal pathologies and personal failings of one very important leader, I think, is profoundly misleading. The reason why the United States and its coalition partners won the Second World War had everything to do with the size of their economies and their ability to mobilize far more efficiently than could Nazi Germany. Germany basically waged war against a coalition of 45 states. It had amassed an enormous empire by the spring of 1942. But ultimately, its economic capacity was just simply not enough to take on the combined might of the United States and also the Soviet Union in particular. Basically, Germany exhausted itself. It overexpanded.
For as long as Hitler remains a powerful and frightening figure, we shall continue to dispute what actually led to the great dictator's downfall. However, it is possible to narrow down our focus to a handful of critical factors. To begin with, waging war on two fronts from 1940 onwards, along with carrying out the final solution at the same time, would prove that evil of such a horrifying nature as this could only be stretched so far. Secondly, a less ambivalent attitude towards the United States would have likely had a tremendous impact on the outcome of the war, an outcome that the combined Allied forces were thankfully able to avert. And finally, in becoming so unrestrictedly overconfident, heedless of his opposition's powers, and incapable of formulating effective military strategy, Hitler would ultimately find himself cornered in Berlin in April 1945, with no means of escape other than cyanide poisoning and a Walther PP pistol. All these explanations can help us to understand why this unparalleled state of terror, violence, and hatred would be cast upon the world for only 12 years rather than for all eternity.